my name is Zhang. I'm from Vassar College. I'm the president of the club there. Despite being a physics major, I always tell people that I'm a history buff. And World War II is one of my favorite time periods. So when we think about World War II, what are the names, events that come to your mind? Something that just pop up in your mind like, about World War II.
Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor.
Iwo Jima.
And
Berlin.
Japan.
The final assault to Berlin.
yes.
Auschwitz.
Okay.
Hitler,
Hitler.
Nanjing
Germany.
massacre and
Yeah.
the Philippines. Yeah.
Oh, I thought you were going to say that.
Anzio Bridge.
Yeah.
Hence your
I've worked at FDR Presidential Library, so for me, Roosevelt would be one of my first answers to this question. But so these are the names that you just mentioned. These are the names, events that we can easily recall. But there's actually an important part of this history that barely gets told. So let me ask you this. At the outbreak of the Second World War, what city had the most Jewish refugees? A city.
City. Warsaw.
San Francisco.
Shanghai.
Berlin.
Exactly.
Berlin?
Shanghai.
Shanghai.
And that's what I'm going to talk about today.
Really?
Yes. In fact, during World War II, there are about 20,000 Jewish refugees living in a northern district of Shanghai called Hongkou. So how did all this happen? Before 1843, Shanghai was just a small fishing village with no foreign population to begin with. And after the First Opium War, Shanghai was forced to be opened as a port to foreign trade. And since then, foreign population, capital, investment have been pouring in. By the early 1900s, Shanghai had become one of the largest cities in the world. Before Hitler rose to power in 1930s, there were about several thousand Jews living in Shanghai, most of whom were Russian Ashkenazim who fled the country because of the revolution of 1917. After Hitler took power in Nazi Germany, he started the persecution of the Jews. So consequently, they had no choice but to leave. But the question was, where? At that time, no Western powers were willing to take in Jewish refugees. And Shanghai was the only city that required neither a visa nor a police certificate. But that didn't make Shanghai a heaven. Right before World War II, Shanghai was divided into several jurisdictions. The southern part of the city was controlled by the Chinese government. To the west, there was the French concession, and to the north, it was the international settlement, jointly controlled by the British and Americans. We all know that during the war, Japan and Germany were war allies. And in 1937, that was when the Sino-Japanese War began. And since then, Shanghai was effectively under the control of Japan. A lot of us might not realize the Holocaust didn't just take place in Europe. At that time, Germany was pressuring Japan to exterminate the Jewish population in Shanghai. But Japan didn't do what the Germans want. There was never a sizable Jewish population in Japan, and consequently, the Japanese were not familiar with the tradition of anti-Semitism. So eventually, their official policy towards the Jews in Shanghai was this. It would not actively embrace the refugees, but it would not deny them entry into Shanghai. And that's why thousands of Jews moved from Europe to Shanghai. And one of the refugees was a boy named Gary Musdorf, and he recalled his initial response to the city. It was a shock, culture-wise and language-wise. But I was still pretty young, so it wasn't that hard for me to adapt to the new setting. I tried everything I can to assimilate into the Chinese culture. In fact, every day after Gary got off work from an import for an import company, he would explore the nightlife of Shanghai, and one of his favorite places was a dance hall on the top floor of a department store. But the situation worsened after 1943, which is when Japan decided to designate a small area of Shanghai and ordered all Jews who arrived in Shanghai after 1938 to move into this district within 3 months. The sanitation was poor and the housing condition was bad. And that's how this district came to be known as the Shanghai Ghetto. Even though life there was bleak, the Jewish community still managed to maintain a rich cultural life. They published 3 daily newspapers, professional musicians gave concerts, they set up a religious school for children, and the charity organization taught English to adults at home. There was another important aspect of life in the ghetto. The Jews were not the only people living there. Living alongside with them were 100,000 Chinese local citizens. And despite the language barriers, they managed to talk to each other, interact with each other. There's this photo that shows a Jewish girl playing with 2 of her Chinese friends, all of them laughing and looking content. After the war was over, most of the Jews living in Shanghai moved either to the States or to Israel. And one of the boys who moved to the States was a man named Werner Michael Blumenthal, who later became the Secretary of Treasury under President Carter. Even decades later, the former refugees in Shanghai who moved to the States, they still got together and held reunion and talked about this period of time spent in a tumultuous period in an unfamiliar city. Some of them managed to go back, and Michael Blumenthal was one of them. Secretary Blumenthal went back to Shanghai several years ago, and he managed to find his old house where he lived in as a kid. So, why am I telling you this history? When we think about history, we always tend to divide it into specific regions. We think about American history, British history, East Asian history. But that's really not what history is all about. History is actually a lot more intertwined. Different groups of people, despite their differences in background, they got together and interacted with each other, despite the geographic restrictions. It's tempting to just focus on the differences that we have, differences in religion, background, ethnicities, but what matters more is to look at the commonalities and the bonds that we share. And this same perspective goes way beyond history. When we think more about commonalities than differences, that's when a whole new world